Hi, I'm Michelle the Irritable Vegan and welcome back to the final video in my Sourdough September series. We're finishing off with a rustic, hearty bread and bean stew. Inspired by a traditional Italian classic ribollita, this vegan, low FODMAP version is comfort food at its best. If you missed the other recipes in this series, I'll leave links to them above and below. But now it's time to get into that stew. I hope you enjoy it. We'll begin by peeling the tomatoes, and if you've been watching my videos for a while you'll have seen me do this before. But if you're new here, then you need to cut a shallow crisscross through the top of your tomatoes, place them in a heat safe jug and cover them in boiling water. Leave the tomatoes submerged to loosen the skin for 2 minutes. For this recipe I use 250 grams or 2 large common vine tomatoes. Whilst the tomatoes sit, add 1 tablespoon of garlic oil to a pan on medium heat. Add 150 grams of diced carrots, 150 grams of diced radish and 20 grams of diced celery, which is my low FODMAP take on a mirepoix base for soups or stews. After 2 minutes, carefully pour the hot water off the tomatoes and run under cold water for a few minutes until cool enough to handle safely. Drain off all the water and carefully peel the skin from the tomatoes. If you followed this technique, the skin should peel away easily from the flesh. Dice the tomatoes and set aside. By now, the mirepoix base should have been cooking for about 10 minutes. Sprinkle over a quarter of a teaspoon of asafoetida, a quarter of a teaspoon of smoked paprika and a generous pinch of salt and pepper. Cook for a further 5 minutes, stirring frequently, then add 2 tablespoons of tomato puree, 1 teaspoon of Dijon mustard and the diced tomatoes. Simmer on low for 5 minutes before adding 70 grams of canned drained butter beans and an optional pinch of dried chilli flakes. Pour in 700 ml of vegetable stock and simmer gently for a further 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, add 80 grams or 2 large handfuls of chopped kale and submerge into the liquid until just wilted. This will take about 2 minutes. Add in a few sprigs of fresh rosemary and 100 grams of roughly torn sourdough bread. Stale or day-old bread is fine, but try using the interior slices rather than the crusty ends at this stage. Stir everything together really well so that the bread starts to soak up all of those delicious juices. To finish off the stew, sprinkle in 30 grams of spring onion greens, 2 generous tablespoons of fresh thyme and 2 generous tablespoons of fresh sage leaves. Stir everything together really well until fully incorporated, then remove the sprigs of rosemary. Carefully ladle the hot stew into a deep oven-safe casserole dish. Alternatively, for the sake of presentation, ladle into 2 individual dishes. Smooth down the top of the stew and cover with another 50 grams of roughly torn sourdough bread. It's at this point that it's best to use the crusty ends of a rustic loaf for maximum flavour and crunch. Gently press the underside of the bread into the stew but don't fully submerge it. The idea is to let the broth soak up from below whilst the top stays crisp and golden. Sprinkle over a heaped tablespoon of nutritional yeast and drizzle over 1 tablespoon of garlic oil, trying to hit every piece of bread with some of the oil. Scatter over a few extra sprigs of fresh thyme and a grind of salt and black pepper. Bake the stew in a preheated oven at 200 degrees Celsius for 15 to 20 minutes until bubbling and golden on top. This delicious herby stew has autumn written all over it. It's hearty, warming and everything I look for in a steaming bowl of comfort food. This recipe is FODMAP safe for 2 generous servings but could easily stretch to 4 if served with polenta or potatoes on the side. The radishes are a brilliant peppery alternative to the traditional onion and add body and bite to the stew. The nutritional yeast replaces the usual parmesan and gives a cheesy umami flavour to the golden crust. I've never really been a fan of the idea of soggy bread, and in the past I've always avoided these types of recipes. I can honestly say this recipe exceeded anything I could have expected and is absolutely delicious. The sourdough bread inside the stew virtually melts away into the sauce, leaving a rich, silky texture that's nothing like what I've been imagining and avoiding all these years. The golden, crispy, cheesy topping is the perfect contrast to the thick stew below, and together it's a magical combination. If you prefer, you could use breadcrumbs, but I personally think these rustic, chunky croutons work much better with the overall dish. Add an optional sprinkle of nutritional yeast to serve. I really hope you'll give this recipe a try. It's definitely going to be featuring in my autumn and winter meal plans in the future. As previously mentioned throughout the series, there can be some confusion regarding FODMAP safe sourdough bread. Always refer to the current serving sizes in the Monash app and check out the helpful resources I've linked below. I've really enjoyed creating this Sourdough September series, and I hope the recipe has encouraged you to put sourdough back on the menu. If it's not for you, then all of the recipes in this series could be made with a rustic gluten-free loaf or used as inspiration for your fructans in wheat low FODMAP challenges. Don't forget to tag me in all of your recipe recreations over on Instagram, and make sure you tune in next week for my first ever intentionally nightshade free recipe. If you've enjoyed this recipe, please don't forget to subscribe, like, comment and share. It means a lot to me and it really does make all the difference to my little channel. As always, thanks so much for watching and I'll speak to you soon. Bye!
Delle belle turbando al riposo, narcisetto a tocino d'amor.